A very warm welcome to my community. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. As always, I'm pleased that you have joined us. Last week's episode ended by celebrating the extraordinary work of Adam Straw Waterman in rebuilding the Church of St. John after the Great Hurricane of 1831. And of course, we called attention to his enduring legacy of building construction in Barbados. We also asked for the church to honor Adam Straw Waterman. This week's episode begins in the same parish, St. John, as we continue the discussion surrounding the destruction of churches by the Great Hurricane of 1831.
St. Mark's Anglican Church, which we refer to as a Chapel of Ease, in the parish of St. John, was reportedly destroyed. St. Mark's Church, Anglican Church, was built in 1829, so it was 2 years later, when this hurricane came along, that the church was destroyed, within 2 years of it being built.
Let's talk about those chapels. He came to Barbados, Bishop Coleridge. He was appointed in June of 1824, and that's why the Anglican Church in Barbados has just celebrated the bicentenary of his appointment as bishop. He didn't arrive in Barbados until the January of 1825. Now, when he got here, St. Mary's Church had been planned because, remember, St. Mary's Church was the site of the original Holy Acre in Bridgetown, and it was called the St. Michael's Church. After a while, it got too small, and so it was decided to build a bigger St. Michael's Church on the site of what is now the Cathedral of St. Michael and All Angels. And so the old St. Mary's Church was either demolished or taken apart by the Vandals, as people do. When a building is abandoned in Barbados for long enough, people take away all of the materials and use it to build their own houses. It's happened so often. The first 6 were spread out. St. Bartholomew's up in Christchurch, Holy Trinity in St. Philip, St. Luke and St. George, and so on. And then he simply added to them. The chapels of ease were all over the country. All of these historic churches in simple Gothic style. I mentioned the first 6 of them, but they were added to by St. Jude's, St. Stephen's in Blackrock. What he was doing was looking at every parish and saying, you have a parish which has been founded on the basis of a church at the center, because the churches provided the governance, the local governance of Barbados for 300 years. And so he said, it is very difficult for people who live in the corners of a parish 3 and 4 miles away for everyone to come to the parish church. And if they did, they would fill it to overflowing. So let us build what he called chapels of ease, which are easy to reach. And so you had 2 or 3 churches in the corners of each parish. So in St. George, when we lived at Ashbury, my family used to go sometimes to St. John's Church, where we had gone for many years, and sometimes to St. Jude's Church, which was just 3/4 of a mile down the hill from Ashbury. And this was a wonderful way, therefore, of bringing religion to the people.
Other chapels of ease destroyed were Holy Cross, also in the parish of St. John, while St. Mary's in Bridgetown survived, and these were all chapels of ease.
But it would seem as if the 1780 hurricane taught the builders of Barbados a lesson, and they built the churches with a great deal more effort and concern for their safety and for their strength and resilience. So St. Michael, St. George, St. Andrew, and St. James all survived the 1831 hurricane. All of the others were so badly damaged that they were radically repaired or restored. Now, when a description is given that a church was demolished or destroyed, it's not clear whether everything went. It's likely that the roof went, some of the walls, but many of the walls may have been retained. Many of the larger houses in Barbados, for example, lost their roof, and with the roof went the top of the walls. And so you can see in some of the homes of Barbados, you can see where the 1780 or the 1831 hurricane damage stopped, and the walls are repaired for another couple of feet in order to put a ring beam in place and put the roof back on. So the parish churches, therefore, were largely rebuilt in 1831.
Now, St. Michael's Cathedral features in an important way in this story about what happened in Bridgetown. It was a church that was built from about 1675 and over the years suffered damage because of various events, storms, and the passage of time also damaged the church and had to undergo repair a number of times. 1750s or so, but immediately a lot of that was undone by the devastation of 1780 when the church was totally destroyed in that hurricane. So it was subsequently rebuilt, but then in the intervening years again it had to undergo repairs, and by the time of the 1831 hurricane it was still in a kind of less than ideal state or condition. However, it was one of the structures that actually remained fairly intact in the storm, along with the St. Mary's Church on the other end of Bridgetown, even though it did lose its roof and the church itself was flooded. But it remained intact enough that in the aftermath of the storm, hundreds of persons were placed there, and we're talking about the poor and the indigent people, and we're talking about the persons who were injured, took shelter there in the storm because, of course, they had nowhere else to go, having lost their homes. So both that church and St. Mary's Church were used to house these people. What's significant about that church is that even though, again, it had lost its roof, and in fact, the church wouldn't be fully repaired until about 1837 or after 1837, so that's some 6 years later, so that would tell you how long it remained in a damaged state, is that in the aftermath of the storm, operations were performed in the church pews. Doctors had to come to that location. We had a whole cohort of them between that and St. Mary's Church to perform operations on the injured persons who were housed there. It was used as an area to provide provisions for the poor. It was an area that provided housing for the poor. And again, just keep in mind that the church really was not in a condition really to house people. And in fact, the numbers of people coming to both churches was such that they even had to turn people away because there were so many people who needed shelter and who needed help with their recovery from the storm.
The Jewish synagogue in Bridgetown, built in 1654, was also destroyed.
And even though Jews were viewed with some suspicion and were not always heavily viewed or viewed in a way that was favorable, they were respected because they gave to a lot of local charities. And so they were given a proper burial without too much of a problem in days after that.
I think the Jewish people are particularly good at doing what they feel they should do. They are very strong in terms of ritualistic and historical patterns of behavior and traditional obligations. And so when the Jewish synagogue was very, very badly damaged, it was apparently rebuilt on the same footprint within 2 years. It didn't take long. And the picture that shows the original synagogue shows it was a different looking building, but it was rebuilt beautifully, absolutely beautifully, by 1833. And so there was a great ceremony and pomp and lavish ceremony to bless it and to open it 2 years after the hurricane. It was just a tremendous feat. You know, and it's remarkable the way people worked in those days to produce buildings in very short time compared to today, when it can take just as long with all the modern equipment.
These houses of worship were all rebuilt, but in most cases it took years for the rebuilding effort to be completed. Let's look at shipping, because shipping took a big hit. Just like what happened recently with Hurricane Beryl, we know how shipping was affected due to that past hurricane. So in 1831, shipping was also badly affected as all the vessels at anchor in Carlisle Bay were driven to the shore. They were beached and wrecked. Some were even laden with cargo. One report revealed that a ship with 200 puncheons of meal was destroyed. The ship and cargo lost.
So that's why it was especially devastating in the 1831 event, because a lot of that infrastructure around it was wiped out, including retaining walls, including the wharf site itself, the pierhead, all of that went through. The eddies, as the Bajans would say, when the waves came in and came crashing in and washed up onto the shores, bringing boats that were up on piles on one side of the river over to the other side and just leaving them there, capsizing almost every boat that you can see. It was just a mess after the storm. I laughed. As Bajans would say, everything get mashed up. So it was just a really bad scene, and it really was a kind of cause a sense of desperation, because it meant that years of recovery would be in store for many of the merchants who relied heavily on this area for their trade. Certainly Bridgetown was an extremely vulnerable space for that storm because it's low lying. It is near the sea, or next to the sea. It has a water course passing through it that brings waters from the gullies of the country. And usually it is extremely vulnerable to winds coming from the southwest, which unfortunately this particular storm really brought to the island. Winds from the south and the south-southwest, bringing waves on shore. Most of the impact that you can see from the storm really occurred in the Corinage and the wharfside area, where the powerful waves destroyed the pierhead and would have washed a number of ships on shore, capsized a lot of the boats that were there, and damaged a lot of the seafront properties. But the entire city was heavily impacted and heavily devastated by the impacts of both the wind, the torrential rains, and the overflowing water from the Constitution River. This being 1831, Barbados was a highly stratified society, of course, with the white, wealthy plantation owners and mercantile community at the top, free coloreds and free blacks in the middle, and the masses and majority population enslaved black persons. And that was, of course, reflected in Bridgetown in terms of the segregated areas where people lived. We had the upscale communities in Nelson Street. Yes, Nelson Street was an upper middle class community. We had areas in Mason Hall Street, Subtle Street. Those areas were also middle class communities. And we had areas in the middle of Bridgetown, which are now given over to commercial activity, High Street, Swan Street, that were also heavily residential. And the majority of the black population who formed the poorer classes lived on the fringes, which would be Robert Street, the area we now know as Green Fields, Church Village, just across the river in what would be now Golden Square. In that area, along River Road and going up Constitution Road, a lot of those would be poorer communities as well. So, and that was reflected in the construction of their buildings, because whereas a lot of the more wealthy people would live, of course, in more permanent and stronger stone structures, you know, with some woodwork features and stuff like that, the poorer communities lived in very small wooden huts that were not very poorly constructed and were generally not going to be strong enough to be able to face the challenges brought on by any significant storm structure, and which is why virtually all of them were wiped out when the storm came. Bridgetown in 1831, as it is today, was a seaport. There was no deep water harbor at the time, so it meant a lot of the boats that brought goods into the island were berthed at Carlisle Bay. Those were brought by smaller boats into the Corinage, where they were landed on the wharf. And so the wharf was a hive of activity almost all the time. You know, large quantities of goods were placed there. And they went to the merchants, many of whom occupied spaces along the wharf side. And in fact, up until in the early part of the 19th century, the 1800s we're talking about, they had their own wharfs to receive their items. But that went away after the colonial government decided that that was too problematic for a number of different reasons, which we wouldn't necessarily get into. But eventually, one wharf was created to receive landed items. And you would have had lots of commercial activity taking place centered on the wharf at the time. Of course, Broad Street then, as it is now, was the center of the commercial activity. Lots of significant businesses were located there, as was the case in Swan Street at the time. A lot of the black people in Bridgetown earned a living by working unloading and loading boats in the area. They worked in with the commercial entities that existed at the time, and a lot of the jobs were clerical in nature, administrative in nature, to process the items that were brought into the island. So at this time, of course, inter-island schooners plied their trade from this location, bringing items from the other islands in the Eastern Caribbean, and we shipped items down to them. You know, fruits and vegetables came up. We sent our furniture, furnishings, we sent our various other items that we constructed here down to the other islands. But we really did do a brisk trade with the other islands at this time. So schooners, small boats, Moses, fishing, of course, would have been an important part of that time. At that time as well, a lot of these would have been berthed in the Corinage, and at that time, you could have come well inside the Corinage, well into the Constitution River. So at this time, the Constitution River would have been a lot more navigable, could encroach much further inland at this point in time, so that made it easier for boats of a certain size, smaller and more medium-sized boats, to bring the items further into the Constitution River, into the Corinage, and they were landed and repaired in this area. So again, the Corinage was just a hive of activity. Now, what should be said about this storm is that it was an equal opportunity destroyer. It wiped out properties belonging to the rich, and especially wiped out properties belonging to the poor. Bridgetown was a far more heavily populated city at that time, populated with extremely poor people in neighborhoods like Robert Street, Church Village. Right behind us here at Constitution Road, a lot of those communities especially were wiped out and laid bare in the few hours in which the storm was hovering over the island in the early hours of August 11th. Many of the public buildings suffered severe damage as well. Right here just behind us in Constitution Road, for example, from 1818 onwards, an area that was under construction. In fact, two schools, the Boys Central School, which later became Commermere School, and the Girls Central School, which later evolved into Queen's College, were located here, as was the St. Michael's Alms House, as was the Lunatic Asylum, and the organization called the Directory for the Propagation of Christian Knowledge was also located at this location. And all of those were wiped out by the storm in a couple of hours. What's significant about that particular location is that at one point, the only area that was available for housing or sheltering persons was the overseer's house at the boys' school. And 100 people were forced to cram in there, including 35 patients from the St. Michael's Alms House. Luckily, they were safe, but unfortunately, a number of the boarders at the two schools lost their lives, and we're talking about children here, of course. The two cooks at the respective schools were also very unlucky. One of them was actually blown from the ruined building into a hedge and was so lacerated by the plants and the foliage that a few days later she died of her injuries. The cook at the boys' school, he suffered a fractured leg, but apparently maybe the shock of that injury or some other reason, he too died a few days after the occurrence as well. So in a matter of hours, the buildings that were located at that site, which had been built just in the last 10 years, all of them were either severely damaged or were eliminated from the map altogether, as well as a number of the small dwellings in the area. Queen's Park at that time was also heavily affected. In fact, the building that's right in front of us, where I'm sitting right now, which was at that time King's House, actually lost its roof as well. As we move further into the city, I spoke about the carenage being heavily damaged. At one point, you found that merchandise, bits of boats, furniture from storefront buildings, all of that was washed into the streets, including Broad Street from the carenage. That's how powerful the waves were. Trafalgar Square was heavily damaged, and buildings located in that area like the Commissariat, which is no longer in existence, and the Treasury, which is not the Treasury that we know today, but would have been in another building located in the area, that too was heavily damaged by the storm. The storm rendered several of the streets impassable because of all the rubble that was blown down. The residences that were located in areas that are now commercial districts, a lot of those buildings were blown into the streets and made the streets impassable. Other neighborhoods like Mason Hall Street, Reed Street, Suttle Street, which were also upscale middle-class neighborhoods, which you might find hard to believe though, based on as we look at those areas. But there too were devastated and ravaged by the powerful winds. Two notable structures that came down in the storm were two buildings belonging to the Freemasons. There was a Masonic temple, and there was another structure that had until recently belonged to the Freemasons but was given up to trusteeship. And those collapsed around 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. In one case, one of the buildings crushed 3 people, and another 9 people died in the other structure. A Hebrew synagogue that was also located in that area too was brought down by the storm. A number of tenements, and there were hundreds of them located in that area, and we're talking towards New Orleans area, what is New Orleans today. Those were wiped out by the storm, and dozens of people died when those buildings collapsed. Of course, they were just board structures, simple board structures in which the people lived at that time. So the poor really were heavily affected by the storm in all segments of Bridgetown in which they lived. Among the neighborhoods that were heavily affected was Fountainville, which had in just recent years become noted for its being a genteel area, an upscale area. It had become a place of note. And it was an area that was heavily populated with lots of coconut trees. So by 9 o'clock the next morning, most of that was gone. A lot of the buildings were knocked down. The coconut groves for which the area was known and for which it was admired were laid bare and were laid flat by the storm. The island had 100 Jews living in it at the time, but only 2 of them actually lost their lives in the storm, and both of them lived at Fontebelle. One of them was a 71-year-old lady who was described as corpulent, which means big boned. She died when she was thrown from her wheelchair and was immediately crushed by the house falling on top of her. The other one was also another lady who lived at another house. One notable occurrence is what happened at the Royal Jail, which was located in Courage Street. And by the way, that jail was located in the same building as the legislature at the time, as well as the judicial courts. And that was a source of amusement for commentators at the time, the whole idea of having prisoners located just downstairs from where the government met upstairs. But you can make of that what you will. I won't get into that anymore. But that too was heavily affected by the storm. The jailer at the time, in an act of humanitarianism and goodwill, opted to release the prisoners from the jails because he recognized what was happening to the structure, and he decided, well, he didn't want to have them killed or destroyed, so he brought them out and had a conversation with them in another slightly more safe section of the prison, and said to them that, but in essence, he tried to make sure that they didn't escape, so he tried to encourage them and use moral suasion to keep them in the prison. So he said to them that if you behaved well, according to the research, if you exercised decorum, that was the word that was used, in terms of staying where you are and not try to escape, this would reflect favorably on you when your case came before the court. If it did otherwise, then it would go the other way, and you would see it in a very dim light. So the prisoners acceded to this. They said, okay, that's fine. But this was during the height of the storm, and the storm was going on outside. So needless to say, as soon as things quieted down a little bit and there was a lull, of course, almost all of them, in fact, all but 3 of them, immediately fled the location and ran out into the city. The interesting thing is that at least 2 of them returned. It was said that one of them returned because he felt guilty about what he had done. He had been charged for murder. And that he recognized what he had done and that he really was deserving of punishment, in this case specifically hanging. So he decided to return to face his destiny in that regard. The other one, apparently, because of the devastation around in the surroundings, really had nowhere to go. So ultimately, he was pretty much forced to return to the area that really still would provide some sort of shelter for him, which was the town jail. But that was an interesting story because it really speaks to human nature in terms of what people are prepared to do, even under the most extraordinary circumstances. Another interesting story that we can perhaps can be brought up from this storm is what happened just to our east in the area of an area we now call the Mar Hole, where a lady who had several children had to take shelter in the Mar Hole. She actually sheltered with one of them. They didn't say whether or not there was an actual shelter there in terms of a structure, but somehow she was able to make it through the storm without too much of a problem in terms of her and the child. They were rescued after everything was calm. Whilst another one of her children went with the child's grandmother, and they waited out the storm in the avenue's entrance just up the street here. But unfortunately, the child died in that situation, and it was believed that it was the force of the wind that suffocated the child in the grandmother's arms. So that was one of the tragedies that came out of the storm. On August 16th, the governor convened a meeting of government officials and merchants and other persons who lived in Bridgetown with a view of finding ways to help the poor. Of course, bear in mind, a lot of these officials themselves, including the governor, had also suffered loss and damage in the storm. But to go on with the recovery effort, he deputized persons as commissioners responsible for collecting the refuse and clearing the streets. And let me just say here that the refuse was such that at some points when it was cleared and gathered in the center of the streets to be carried to the way, the bank of garbage reached, in some cases, 5 to 6 feet high. So that was just how much garbage there was in the streets from buildings being thrown down and from the devastation brought by the waves and the flooding waters that washed all of the various structures and the contents therein into the streets. So the governor brought these persons together with a view of identifying persons who really needed the help. They got the help of a women's association who were responsible for cooking food and providing meals for the poor at St. Michael's Church as well as over in Bay Street. They would have raise a subscription list to solicit funding to provide, as you would imagine, clothing and different items that people needed. And this was, in other words, the resources available to the people at the time in the city were brought to bear almost immediately in the aftermath of the storm once people decided, well, you know, what was needed and what was required. There was a lot of inspections of buildings took place, a lot of structures that appeared intact in the storm, even though some of those were condemned simply because they were so cracked and fissured by both the storm and the simultaneous earthquake that had occurred, that even though at first glance they appeared to be in a good state, a lot of them actually were useless and had to be condemned and had to be taken down as well. So these were some of the things that took place in the days following the storm.
Thank you very much, Randy, and thanks to all of the presenters for your good work in researching the experiences of the 1831 hurricane here in Barbados. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. The series continues next week at the same time. As we always say here, please be good to yourself and look out for the interests of your neighbors.